Good afternoon, everybody. Apologies for the slight delay in starting the webinar. We're talking about getting ready for the Pearson endpoint assessments today. My name is Rohini Bhattacharya. I'm the head of Apprenticeship Services for Pearson, and I'm joined by my colleague, Liz Burnett, who is the EPA Delivery Manager. Just for a few logistics to be aware of, Liz and I are in different office locations in different parts of the country. So there will be a bit of a handover as we go through the webinar. So there might be a few pauses, so just do bear with us on that. Also, we will be taking questions as we go along. So if you do have any questions, please use the questions box on your screens to post your questions, and I'll be supported by my colleague Sapna Kimani, who would be reading out the questions as we go along. So thank you very much for joining again, and hope this is useful. This is a continuation of our EPA service delivery logistics and details from last week that we had done. So just going over the endpoint assessments in terms of what they're about, which most of you or all of you would know already. The endpoint assessments essentially are an independent synoptic assessment of the skills, knowledge, and behaviors that the apprentices go through or gain throughout their apprenticeship program. And essentially, the endpoint assessment is a accumulation assessment that is making sure that the apprentice is ready and competent to perform the role that they have been taken on within their organizations. As an endpoint assessment organization, it is the EPA organizations need to be registered with the Education and Skills Funding Agency. So essentially, only approved endpoint assessment organizations are need to carry out or are approved to carry out this endpoint assessments for each standard. For that, we need to be registered on the ESFA's ROPA, as it's called now, which stands for the Register of Endpoint Assessment Organizations. What are the responsibilities of EPA organizations like ourselves? We are responsible for designing, administering, and marking the assessments and making sure that they are robust, valid, and reliable as well. There are a number of stakeholders involved in this new standard, apprenticeship new standards landscape. So it probably makes sense to actually outline these at the outset. This is primarily from the perspective of you as providers or employers or customers to be aware of the different layers of governance that is in place in order for us to deliver the endpoint assessment. So obviously, as approved training providers, there are roughly, I think as of end of January, in excess of 2,100 approved training providers on the ROTAP. On top of that, there are the endpoint assessment organizations. So again, this is different from the normal awarding organization landscape. Any organization can actually set themselves up as an assessment organization, as an EPA organization. So currently on the ROPA, as we call it, there are 103 different endpoint assessment organizations. The endpoint assessment organization are then governed in terms of their quality assurance by what we call an external quality assurance body or an EQA body. And currently there are 35 of these registered. And there can be 4 different types of EQA bodies. It can either be an employer-led body. Some of the trailblazer groups that were set up to write the standards, the new standards, have actually then put themselves forward as an EQA body as well. The EQA body can also be a professional body. So as an example, I think People First is the EQA body for the visitor economy, including hospitality and retail standards. The Institute for Apprenticeships can also be an EQA body, and currently they are actually an EQA body for quite a number of different new standards. And finally, Ofqual, the qualifications regulator, can also be an EQA body. And there are, again, between the Institute for Apprenticeships and the Ofqual, there are a number of standards that actually have the responsibility to be an EQA for. On top of the EQA body, the Institute for Apprenticeships also has a monitoring and governance responsibility to monitor the EQA bodies themselves. So while the EQA bodies' responsibilities are to make sure that each of the EPA organizations, the kind of assessments that they carry out are consistent across different EPA organizations. The Institute for Apprenticeships, on top of that, would make sure that the EQA bodies are doing their job properly as well. So it's an additional layer of governance for the EQA bodies. And then finally, there is the Education and Skills Funding Agency, which is responsible for all the funding and compliance aspects of the apprenticeship standards. So yourselves would be, as providers, would be getting funded from the ESFA. And we, as the EPA organizations, are also getting funding from the ESFA as well. So essentially, that's the those are all the stakeholders that are involved within the new apprenticeship new standards. So coming to the actual EPA process, what does that involve? We have done a few pilot endpoint assessments towards the latter half of 2017. So what we are sharing here is essentially what we are hearing from the market, from our customers, from our training providers in terms of what they need to know in practice. So one of the things which come up consistently is around what are we working towards, because this is not a formative assessment. It's a synoptic assessment, so it happens right at the end. However, when when training providers are delivering the training, they need to be aware what they are working towards. So, starting with the end in mind. And this has been typically tricky in the last few months, specifically because assessment plans have been changing. The endpoint assessment organizations are still gearing up to speed to get their assessment instruments in place. The assessment plans to which the endpoint assessment organizations develop their instruments around are not typically very clear on what they're asking for. So we have had to go back and forth with EQA bodies, the Trailblazer groups, IFA, on a number of occasions to make sure that we have clarity on what is it that we're actually developing. The other consistent theme that comes through for us as an EPA organization is the lack of a structured learning plan. Now, there is a standard for the new apprenticeship standards, which outlines what the outcomes or what the apprentice needs to achieve. However, on the back of that, any training provider can actually create their own learning plan to come up with a way of how to deliver that. And typically, that can be as varied as the number of training providers. So some training providers work closely with their employers to make sure that they are aligning with what the employers are already doing for the apprentice in the workplace, while some other training providers have a very structured learning plan which adheres very closely to the standard itself. The actual job of the apprentice and the organizational context also comes into play when we are talking about the new standards. So as an example, the customer services practitioner, for example, we've seen that the context of a customer services within a call center environment is quite different from that of a customer services advisor within an NHS trust, for example. And that organizational context needs to be taken into consideration both for the delivery of the training as well as for the assessment element as well. If we miss that organizational context, we can be putting ourselves into barriers to evaluate based on a framework, but missing the holistic nature of these assessments as well. There has been a lot of confusion around the gateway readiness, for example. Typical questions being, how do we decide the apprentice is ready? When do we sign off the apprentice for the gateway? What happens next? Who actually signs this off? So a brief clarification on these. It is the employer's decision, and they can do this in consultation with the provider if they so wish. But the decision to sign off the apprentice on the gateway is the employer's decision. What we would recommend is that it's a three-way consultation process between the employer, the training provider, and the apprentice themselves, because all three parties need to be confident that the apprentice is actually operating at the level that the employer needs them to operate in order to be classified or assessed as being competent in their role. So ideally, it should be a sit-down process where there are the discussions, there's a consultation, there is documentation that is completed to make sure that the gateway process has been signed off. And also the other thing to remember here is that it is a holistic assessment which happens after the gateway. So at the gateway stage, the evaluation that takes place between those three parties would be not only in terms of the skills and abilities that the apprentice has demonstrated, but also in terms of the behaviors. And this is typically, it might be typically something that the apprentice or the training providers might miss, that how do you actually assess these behaviors? There are various tools and methodologies that are detailed within the standards or the assessment plans. There can be tests that can be administered to check for these behaviors, or there can be regular one-to-ones which the employer or the line manager of the apprentice carries out, which actually record and evidence the behavioral changes or development that the apprentice has gone through. And the final thing to remember at the gateway stage is the fact that we need to evidence the gateway sign-off process and sign some declarations at that point as well. So that is a culmination of everything that the apprentice has done on the on-program or the training stage, and that needs to be done right from the day that the apprentice has started to then culminate at the gateway sign-off stage. In terms of the various things that the employer, the apprentice, and the provider need to be aware of, we've kind of boxed them into three different categories, just to make it easy for everyone involved to take into consideration what they need to keep in mind when they are coming up to the endpoint assessment stage. The first box, as we call it, is around the structure of the EPA. So every endpoint assessment is quite different. They have different parts to it, so we call them components. So every endpoint assessment has different components to it. Typically, what we have seen across the different standards is this list of 8 or 9 different categories or components is the exhaustive list of what is contained within an endpoint assessment. So between a multiple choice test, short answers, professional discussion, portfolio evidence, or practical test, this covers a whole gamut of the different permutations and combinations of components that you would find within an EPA. Typically, we've seen between 3 to 4 components within an endpoint assessment. It does vary from standard to standard. Some of them have 2 elements as well. It really depends on the sector, the employer body, and a lot of different factors. There is no logic to it. It just is very, very different for each standard. From a delivery perspective, some of the things which you as a provider and the employer need to be aware of, and we are covering this during our contractual agreement process, is the requirements for English and Maths qualifications, functional skills as we call them, in terms of the place of delivery for an endpoint assessment. And this is typically important for places, for endpoint assessments which involve a workplace observation, for example, or for hospitality kind of endpoint assessments where it might be a live environment. So we need to be aware of what the place of delivery might be and who actually ascertains where that place would be. The delivery duration allowed for the endpoint assessments, again, is something that needs to be taken into consideration. So some of the standards, some of the assessment plans of the standards actually stipulate the maximum duration, including the reassessments, that is allowed per standard. So some of them dictate that it needs to be within 3 months. Some of the adult care ones, for example, say it can be within the next 12 months after the gateway stage. So it does vary. And again, it's something that needs to be clarified and confirmed during the time of the customer touch points that we have. Reassessment policy, we covered that extensively in the previous webinar. So again, the number of reassessments differ from one endpoint assessment to the other. Pearson do have a policy of charging for the reassessments, and again, these are detailed out and discussed in detail at the time of contractual agreements signed with yourselves. Feedback to the apprentice, the employer, again, this can be tailored or made bespoke as per your requirements, as per the apprentice and the employer's requirements. So again, a delivery consideration to be borne in mind. And so also things like how the results would be delivered, what are the certification timelines, how does that match up with the expectations set with the apprentice and the employer, and if there are any other implications for that, for example, in terms of the contractual continuity of the apprentice with the organization. So all of those considerations need to be borne in mind when we're talking about the actual delivery of the endpoint assessment. And then finally, there is a lot of administration involved in the delivery of the endpoint assessment. So this does post a burden in terms of the capacity available, both at the employer's end, at the provider's end, and at the end of the endpoint assessment organization. So just to highlight that there are administration details, documentation, logistics that need to be clarified, discussed, and completed around the quality assurance aspects. EQA bodies typically carry out audits. They have been quite extensive in the initial part because they want to make sure that their frameworks are actually in line with what is that is being delivered. So there is involvement from all parties, all stakeholders when it comes to EQA audits. You then have the claims process around the digital apprenticeship services. So at this stage, at this moment, it's only the providers who are able to claim their funding using the DAS. Then there is a separate ILR returns process, which is at the ESFA. And again, there is data exchanges around the apprentice between the training provider and the endpoint assessment organization and the employer as well. Then there are issues like the contracts with the endpoint assessment organizations via the providers. What is the quality of the independent assessors? How do the providers and employers be assured of the quality of the assessors that are carrying out the assessments from the endpoint assessment organization? And then something around the training and consistency. So, if as a provider you are asked a question by the employer, what is your response around the training and consistency element? So there is a lot of administration involved. There is a lot of joined up working that's involved between the three main stakeholders, i.e. the employer, the training provider, and the endpoint assessment organization. So it's good to just outline that at the outset, because it's just not like an endpoint assessment organization coming in right at the end to carry out an assessment. It is far more involved process than that. So again, going back to our experience from last year around the different endpoint assessments that we have delivered, we have introduced what we call different stages to our EPA service delivery and touch points with the customer. And this is based on our experience and learnings from our pilot delivery around endpoint assessment. So what I'm going to outline here are the different stages of the endpoint assessment service delivery, the timeline at which this particular stage is triggered, and what are the processes or details that are discussed or carried out at that stage. So the first stage is the EPA contract signing stage, which happens once the employer and the provider contract has been signed. And at that point, the provider organization signs an EPA services agreement with the endpoint assessment organization. From a Pearson's perspective, the processes that would be triggered at that point are the discussions around the EPA price per apprentice, what are the components involved within the endpoint assessment that is specifically being included within that contract, what are the different delivery methods for those different components, the reassessment policy discussed in detail, including the pricing and the payment terms that would be applicable at that stage. 8 weeks, stipulating 8 weeks after that contract signing stage, and definitely within the 6 months before the estimated endpoint assessment date, we will initiate what we're calling a endpoint assessment planning meeting. And at that stage, the assessment services team from Pearson would carry out a detailed planning meeting with the employer and the training provider. And at that stage, there's some of the things that we would discuss is the organizational context and the role that the specific apprentices are working within. And an estimation of the approximate dates that the endpoint assessment are due to be confirmed and carried out for, and also the delivery methods, the place where they would be carried out. Our expectation setting around the gateway sign-off process, the typical delivery duration on the endpoint assessment, and that differs from one standard to the other. Our expectations around the evidence requirements, and then what kind of on-progress mapping we would be expecting to be completed by the training provider. After 3 months from there, and there is nothing that prevents the account managers to have a monthly update session with the providers from the 6 months through to that next stage, which is the 3 months prior to the estimated EPA date. We are introducing what we're calling a countdown to EPA process. And this is a monthly update process, which happens within the with the apprenticeship services team at Pearson and the training provider and the employer. We will consult at the EPA planning meeting. We will consult how that process would work in practice, whether the provider and the employer would want to be involved in all of those meetings. So those are the kind of discussions which will set expectations at the planning meeting stage. So 3 months prior to the estimated EPA date, we will check on how the program is progressing, how the apprentice is progressing. There might be delays, or the apprentice might have gone sick or on holiday, which would have an impact on the estimated EPA date. So just making sure that we're on track with the confirmed date or estimated dates, which have been indicated initially. We'll set expectations around English and math evidence. Obviously, before putting the apprentice on the program, you have evaluated whether they need English and maths and whether they're progressing towards that, and what would be the evidence requirements to make sure those are checked out at the gateway stage. We will again outline the different components and how those would be delivered, whether it's going to be an on-screen test. If, for example, the apprentice needs to collate a portfolio, then we will make sure that there is a guideline template available and the apprentice and the training provider are clear on what that needs to involve. Any kind of special needs requirements for the apprentice, which then facilitates a requirement to understand the access and facilities requirements during the EPA delivery stage. We will also outline what the marking and grading process would be for the endpoint assessment. So typically there is an aggregation requirements in terms of the weightage to the different EPA components, which add up to the final EPA result. And then we'll also outline what our appeals process would be for the apprentice to actually appeal against their results that they get. The second of the countdown to EPA touch points happens 2 months prior to the estimated EPA date again. And at this stage, the apprentice needs to be booked for the EPA on our systems, on the Pearson systems. At this stage, the apprentice details would then appear on the endpoint assessment organization's systems. And that is the point where an assessor is allocated to the apprentice. We will also make sure that we have visibility on the gateway sign-off dates. So ideally, 2 months prior to the EPA, estimated EPA date, the provider, apprentice, and the employer needs to agree the approximate date when the gateway would actually occur. We'll also outline what the feedback process would be. So if we are going to carry out all the endpoint assessment components on the same day, for example, then would we give feedback at the end of a specific component being completed? Or if the components are split over a number of days, then how would the feedback work? And whether that feedback would be to the apprentice directly or the line manager of the apprentice as well, or both for that matter. And then we'll confirm what our results SLA would be. Typically, we're working towards a 7-day turnaround. So from the point of a assessment of a component being carried out, 7 months late after that date, we will actually give a written results and feedback to the apprentice and the line manager. We also need to get a declaration signed from the apprentice for them to consent the EPA organization to collect the ESFA to collect the apprenticeship certificate from ESFA. So we have a templatized form, which we will share with the training provider and the line manager to get it signed from the apprentice, so that we can actually process their apprenticeship certification claim from the endpoint assessment, from the ESFA directly. Finally, the third and final stage, which is the third countdown to EPA meeting, is estimated to be at a month prior to the estimated EPA date. And at that point, we'll make sure that the endpoint assessment date still stands, and we will actually finalize the dates when that would actually, the endpoint assessment components will be delivered on. We would hopefully have got the achievement evidence for the English and maths, or have a date from when the achievement evidence would be made available to the endpoint assessment organization. And that's one of the evidence collection that needs to be in place at the gateway sign-off stage as well. The gateway sign-off process would have been agreed, the date confirmed, and the evidence requirements, we'll go over that again. And then any components which need a submission of a portfolio or a project or a presentation, we would just agree the logistics of that and the approximate dates for submission by the apprentice, and agree that with the employer, the training provider as well. And hopefully, if all of that goes to plan, then the gateway stage would happen. And at the gateway stage is when the onus of the apprentice to undergo the assessment transfers over to the endpoint assessment organization. Now, what I've detailed there is the service delivery process, which occurs at a generic level. Each of those elements need to be tailored to the specific standard that we are carrying out the endpoint assessment for. So as part of our customer touchpoint process, what we are going to be doing is to tailor this process to each of the standards. And going forwards, once you have signed the contract EPA Services agreement, we will initiate that process on a standard by standard basis with the provider and the employer organization. So I'm going to pause there briefly before I hand over to my colleague Liz Burnett to go through the getting ready to for Pearson's EPA Services, and I'll pass over to my colleague Sapna to go through some questions, if that's okay.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions. The first question, I'll read it out. The EPA planning meeting is suggested to occur a minimum of 6 months before the EPA date. Doesn't the employer decide who they want to use? And at what point is this decided?
Okay. Yes, you're absolutely right. It is the employer who decides who the endpoint assessment organization is going to be. Ideally, we would encourage this discussion to happen as soon as the apprentice has started the program, because the employer might want to go through a process of selection, for example, or they might want to invite in different endpoint assessment organizations to come and present what their endpoint assessment looks like. So it is really up to the employer how they want to go through. What we do recommend is that the providers do play an active part in supporting the employer to make that decision. However, the final decision is very much down to the employer themselves.
Okay, another question. If a subcontractor is delivering, is it correct in saying that the contract, the organization, and so on is still up to the prime training provider?
Yeah. So in that scenario, our understanding is that the employer has signed the contract with the main provider, the prime contractor. If that is the case, then yes, it is the prime contractor who signs the EPA contract with the endpoint assessment organization to deliver the EPA on behalf of the employer. The arrangements with the subcontractors and the main provider is separate to this, and we don't need to be involved in that detail.
Another question. So with regards to the EPA contract signing itself, does this contract between the EPA and training provider need to be done for every employer, or just once for all employers that are used?
Yeah, it's a good question, and we covered this in our webinar last week, Friday, actually. The end-point assessment contract needs to be completed on a per-employer basis. So, for example, if there is a training provider who is working with 10 different employers, then unfortunately that training provider would have to enter into 10 different contracts, one per employer. And the rationale for that is from a legal perspective. If, for example, God forbid, something goes wrong in terms of the payments for an employer, then the training provider or the other employers should not be liable rather, for that contract going hayward. So hence it needs to be a contractual agreement or commercial agreement on a per employer basis.
Okay, and just another question, more a clarification about confirming whether the apprentice doesn't get their results within 7 months. Was that correct?
7 days, not 7 months, sorry, 7 days. So the current service level agreement that we are putting in place would be a turnaround of results after the EPA component has been assessed for the results to be delivered 7 days from that component being assessed.
Okay, we have no more questions at this stage, so yes, let's resume.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Sapna. And I'll now hand over the control to Liz Burnett, who is in a different location, as I mentioned, for Liz to then take us through the getting ready for EPA from a Pearson's perspective. Over to you, Liz.
Thank you, Rahini. I'm just bringing up my screen now. I hope everyone can see that. Put it in presentation mode. So I'm going to be talking through a bit more of the detail now when it comes to the delivery of EPAs. And first of all, I just want to walk you through, introduce you to the type of colleagues who you'll be working with as part of the EPA services, and we are part of one EPA services team. You'll be working with account managers first of all, and they will be owning the relationship with you. They'll be your first port of call when it comes to the apprenticeship product and service inquiries that you may have. We have our apprenticeship service managers who will be responsible for managing the contracts with you and setting those up and actually bringing you on board in terms of that EPA journey with us. And we have our EPA delivery team who will be responsible for the management of the end-to-end EPA delivery. And that involves all the logistical side of things, the booking, the scheduling, understanding all of the context that's been and the information that's been built up through the various touch points you've had to date, making sure that we're meeting our SLAs, that you get your results and grading on time. And if there are any issues, we will support any appeals or inquiries following those EPAs. And we're also responsible for the quality assurance of them. And we wouldn't be able to do any of that without our independent endpoint assessors, who are professionals from the relevant industries associated with each and every EPA. They will be assessment and industry experts, and they will be supported and quality assured by our internal quality assurers. So those are the different members of the team that you'll be coming into contact with as part of this process. And this visual here actually just breaks down a lot of what Rahini has already been talking about, really, and it's the implementation process. You've got the three different areas there that I've just been talking through. The accounts team that are taking you from the point of signing that letter of intent, of thinking ahead, of putting that contract together with you as the employer and any training provider that are involved. There are different handover points then to the apprenticeship services managers, and then through to the EPA delivery team. And that's the process that we'll be following for each EPA. And this is more of the detail that sits behind it. Rahini's already alluded to the fact that every apprenticeship standard and EPA is different. They contain different components, and we need to be developing a really in-depth understanding of how your organisation works from the kind of work that your apprentices are doing to the working patterns of them, what the EPAs themselves actually mean to you within the organisation, all the different timelines, etc. that Rahini's been talking about. So those different touch points that we've walked through before are underpinned by this type of information that we've pulled together for every standard, and this is lifted from the assessment plan. And as Rahini said earlier, there are some changes which are taking place with assessment plans at the moment, so we have to make sure that we keep on top of any of those changes, and through the various touch points with you, we will be communicating the impact of those. We're finding that as EPAs are being delivered and there's some room for reflection, or even before they're getting to the point of delivery, some changes are being made to the plan. So as I said, they need to be communicated to you. So this is the kind of information that we'll be collecting along the way and sharing with you to make sure that you're pulling together everything you need to, that you're submitting at the right time to us, and that we're sharing the information back with you at the relevant points. So you've got the on-programme stages, which will give you an idea of the kind of thing that you should be building up and supporting your apprentices to achieve. You've got the 2 months before the EPA point, just delving in again into some of the detail there about getting ready for the gateway and the kind of evidence that needs to be pulled together. What happens at gateway, what you need to submit, the fact that we'll be verifying that gateway evidence, and then that essentially will open up the EPA period to you, and you'll be working through those different endpoint assessments in the way that we have agreed with you in our contract, and that'll be moving through to actually sharing those final grades and results with you as per the requirements of the assessment plan. And the final one here that Rahini's already talked about before, we have a reassessment policy. We always need to start off in terms of our approach with a conversation with you. Not every standard will have a position on reassessments, so we need to make sure that whatever we put in place is relevant and fully understood. I'm just going to talk through how we work with our endpoint assessors now, or IEAs. And we have a management framework around the way we approach this work based on lessons learnt to date as well. And of course, there are a number of requirements coming from those external QA bodies and conditions for us being a registered EPA organisation that we need to take on board as well. So we have the process running through from how we recruit and procure those assessors through to how we select, train and then standardise them. And the standardisation and training activities will have a bit of a mixed model in relation to this, and make sure that, because every EPA is different, every assessor profile will be different, and because we're looking to work with people who are occupationally competent and have that kind of currency in the workplace, we need to make sure that our training standardisation actually works around the patterns of those colleagues. So we'll be having some initial podcasts, face-to-face training, which will act as a kind of core training activity that can cater for different assessors working with different EPAs. We have EPA-specific webinars that will run through all the details and the processes related to the EPA in question, and it will also include relevant standardisation activities so we can be confident that everyone is working to the same standard and it is demonstrating the kind of behaviours as well that we would expect of our IEAs before they come out to start working with you. And on an ongoing basis, we'll be having refresher training and standardisation activities. A lot of that will take on the lessons learned from delivery and feed those back in. And all of that kind of work will need to be evidenced to those who are interested in the wider sector. Underpinning our approach, we have our EPA Quality Handbook that talks about the detail behind our IEA management framework, as well as the kind of quality measures that support our work. We have essentially an IEO code of conduct. We have an assessor handbook and a toolkit that will support our assessors to carry out their work effectively. And it really goes into a huge amount of detail as to what's expected to make sure that you as the employer receive a really high quality service, and that we're always taking on feedback from you and making sure that feeds into continuous improvement. Because there's such an emphasis on IEA competence and currency, we will be expecting assessors to maintain their CPD and share that with us. And as I mentioned, there are an awful lot of policies and processes that underpin our work, and these are some of them. We need to make sure that anyone that we're working with, from the IEAs and IQAs through to our delivery partners and customers, understand that there is this framework around our approach. And this sort of summarises the way in which we work, really. And Rohini's talked a lot about this already in terms of the different stakeholders involved. We have, at the heart of all of this is the apprentice. We have our endpoint assessments. And we need to think differently now. And I know that some of those listening will be familiar with us as an awarding organisation. Some of you might not be, but this is a different approach. We are assessing and we are internally quality assuring those assessments. And as our awarding body role, we would be typically externally quality assuring rather than internally quality assuring. So it's a slightly different role that we have in the system now. And as Rohini mentioned, there are lots of different types of organisations that will be externally quality assuring us. And then the Institute for Apprenticeships that has that overarching role in the system. And of course, underpinning all of this are our conditions as a registered organisation. So there's an awful lot of checks and balances that are being developed at the moment and embedded across the system, and lots of different requirements depending on the EPA and the EQA organisations. And what we need to do is kind of hide the wiring, so to speak, so it doesn't affect you too much, but it gives you the confidence that we're doing what we need to be doing to meet those requirements. And you've heard a lot already today about the amount of work we're going to be doing to make sure that the EPAs are well planned and well thought out. Take on board everything you need as an organisation. So our continuous improvement framework looks like this. It's very much checking at every point, from all the way through those different touch points with you leading up to the EPA, through to making sure that you had a high quality and relevant experience after you've interacted with our assessors when they've come out to visit you or undertaken remote assessments, and making sure that all of that feedback from you, from external quality assurance organisations, from apprentices, from all the different stakeholders in the system actually feed in to the way that we then improve our services. So that's a continuous kind of feedback loop there. And as this is so new and it's all becoming established, it's so important that we're able to remain responsive and make sure that we are doing everything we can to deliver a high quality service for you. So that, you know, we've talked about those touch points before. There are many more that we'll be wanting to establish as well, just to make sure that everything's going as planned. And at that point, I'm going to hand back over to Rohini, but I think we're going to pause slightly for any more questions people may have.
Okay, yes, so we have a couple of more questions. So a few following on from earlier ones. So does the apprentice get initial feedback and an indication of grading post the EPA, or is nothing given for the first 7 working days?
Yes, that they are given feedback at the end of that EPA, and then that will be confirmed in that 7-day period.
Okay, so next question. Do we have a model contract set up that we can share with the audience?
I think I'll take that, Liz, if that's okay. The model contract is currently with the account managers, so they should be coming out to schedule a meeting with you to take you through that model contract. If you're not an existing Pearson customer or center, then do please get in touch with us. By all means, please use our website email address to get in touch to highlight that you want to have visibility of that services, and we will assign an account manager to come out and see you with the contract details.
Another question. Will there be a formal qualification for the independent EPA?
Liz?
For the assessors, I'm assuming.
The independent EPA.
It's something that we're considering, and it would essentially formalise the training and standardisation programmes that we'll have in place.
Okay, and there was just a couple more questions regarding which standards are set up to do EPA for. Someone was asking that this information was not available on our website, but I think we can send this through directly and need to update our website.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, we don't have any more questions, so I think we can move on.
Okay. So if you just making sure that we've got the. Okay, so if following all of that information around the logistics and details of the framework around quality assurance and the details around the delivery of the. If you think that you are now ready to EPA as an endpoint, as a provider or an employer, what are the steps that you need to go through? So the first stage, as somebody has asked already, is to ensure that you have a provider contract signed and in place. That's the trigger point for all the things that we have discussed today in this webinar to start and be initiated. Do speak to your account manager if you haven't got that contract signed, or if you haven't got any details, or you need any more clarifications on the basis of what you have seen and heard today. And the next stage for that would be to then schedule the EPA planning meeting, which would be front-ended by your account manager or by a specific apprenticeship services manager, as we have mentioned. In terms of more details behind what sits within these customer touch points and the countdown to EPA processes, we will do a more detailed walk through that service, and that session is scheduled for the 9th of March between 12:30 and 1:30, and it's titled the Pearson EPA Service. Please do make time to go onto our website to book yourself onto that webinar. And in that webinar, we will take you through a couple of examples of specific standards and how the countdown to EPA process would work for them, and how we would actually manage and walk through the touchpoint system once we have a contract in place between the provider and the EPA organization. So I'm hoping that a lot of you would sign up to that detailed webinar as well. In the meantime, thank you very much for your participation and your time today. I hope that has been useful and has given some more details around what our EPA service looks like. And if you do have any more questions, please do send them through, and we will circulate them shortly after this webinar. Thank you very much. Have a very good weekend, and we will speak again shortly.